Beautiful Evandale in Tasmania. But how do you approach a busy, complicated scene like this? First, you must simplify it, decide what needs to be included and what doesn't, and decide on a centre of interest, and if needed, embellish it so that it tells a story. The first stage is to apply a unifying underwash to all the big areas in shade. Now this will link all the different buildings together and create a warm glow across the whole painting to offset the bright white sunlit spaces. I plan to complete the painting in just 2 or 3 washes, bringing in the small details only at the end. And this helps to achieve that lovely transparency that is unique to watercolour. As we work on the areas in shade, we want to cut around all the things that are in direct sunlight, such as the bushes growing above the fences, the veranda posts, the round sign, and the outdoor furniture under this veranda. Now, we're mixing our colours on the paper, and the intensities are actually weaker than they look here through the camera lens. I think there's a little bit too much wetness in these areas, so I'm just picking some of the excess up with a damp brush. Now, another way to deal with too much wetness is to soak some up with a tissue, but be very quick to soften the edge with a wet brush of clean water. When you reach the hedge, drop in a weak light green wash on the front and the side, but leave a thin white line along the top where the hedge is struck by bright sunlight. Now don't worry about defining the shaded areas at this stage, we'll deal with that later. Now we come to the white church building, and a light mix of blue and red, making a purpley grey, is applied to the shaded side of the chimney. Now, using a lighter tone of the same colour, use a dry brush technique to indicate the undulations of the corrugated roof, but leave some of it untouched as we're striving for a painterly look and not slavishly copying a photo, so we don't need to paint in every detail. Then with a wet brush of colour, paint the shaded wall of the church entry and just paint over any windows and doors, as we'll be defining all of these later. When you reach the bottom area of the door, remember to cut around any bushes and fence posts that are in full sunlight. I'm using the dry brush technique on the roof of the church. Take your time between strokes and try to make each stroke in the direction of the corrugated sheets. I'm adding a little stroke of water here and there for variation of tone, and the dry brush technique leaves little bits of white paper which indicates the sparkle of sunlight. Now this wall of the building needs to be a similar colour to the smaller wall, but it will make for a very cold and boring wall if we just continued this cool grey right over the entire wall. So I'm going to drop in some warm colour in the lower half. Now you might be surprised to see that this yellow isn't mixing with the blue to make green, and that's because I'm limiting the wetness of the blue so it doesn't want to run down uncontrollably, as I only just touch it with the yellow and now the red. Mixing your colours on the paper can be hit and miss and must be carefully managed in terms of wetness, timing and colour saturation. But the gorgeous effects you can get make it so much more exciting than mixing colours on your palette. As I tilt the board, you can see that the colours are wet enough to blend, but there's not too much of a bead where the blue meets the yellow and red. Before the lower section of the wall dries, I can immediately begin painting the yellow wall of the main house. And jumping ahead, you'll notice that I've cut around the veranda posts and the lacework, and most importantly, the head and shoulders of the lady leaning on her gate. Use a small brush to cut neatly around the figure and the lacework, but change to a bigger brush to get colour on the larger areas quickly. Now I want this picture to have a soft undefined perimeter. So here I'm softening the side of the picture by swiping a large, clean, damp brush from the outside edge into the painted area to get a smudgy, undefined look. If you have any beads, like I have, run them up to the top and from side to side so that each section dries evenly, avoiding any backwash or cauliflowers. Now the final wash goes on this roof. To vary textures, I'll start this one by laying in clean water and using the wet into wet technique. I'll drop in some red first, then a little blue, and just a touch of yellow to grey it off a little. And remember to finish the right hand side with a smudgy undefined edge. My plan here is to end up with a grey reddish roof that will offset the big green tree that's going to sit behind that house. But I don't want it to demand too much attention itself, which might distract the viewer from the centre of interest, which is of course in the bottom right quarter of the picture. Once these colours are on, I'll gently blend them using upward strokes with a flat brush, a damp flat brush, in the direction of the corrugated iron. And you might note how I've left a dry white line, which might be the veranda guttering, between the still wet yellow wall and the roof. Now I let everything dry thoroughly overnight, and now we're ready to glaze over the parts of the buildings that are most in shadow. Now that's not to say areas of cast shadow, which will come in later. I begin with a bluey purple mix made from my red and blue, which are mixed on the palette this time. The shadows under the verandas are darker than those on the walls on the shaded sides of the buildings, so use a consistency of around 4 for these areas. And as you work around the sunlit sign and the outdoor furniture, they'll really begin to pop out now. When you come to the part of the roof that faces away from the sun, use a very light mix of the same colour. And when you come to the wall on the shaded side of the house, use a mix between the two. Now that's a bit dark, so I'm going to introduce some clean water to lighten this wash. Mixing your colours on the paper doesn't have to be scary. If you put a brush of too dark colour on, just add some water. The thing with wet into wet painting is that as long as you keep your washes wet and alive, you can keep working into them until you get it right. With the church door, just darken the whole area slightly, including the reveal. And as best you can, cut around the bushes, but give them a broken edge by just dotting paint randomly around the tops of them. Now the round decoration on the gable is indicated by a little crescent shape on one side. The other side of the circle is lost in the blinding white light of the wall, as is the lacework on the right side of the gable, which we'll address later. Now I'm putting some shadow on this wall, cutting around the veranda of the house next door. And to preserve the look of reflected light that we worked so hard to get in our first wash, I'm going to be dropping in clean water in the lower part and just bringing it up to meet the darker paint. Use the same brush of dilute paint to continue down under that veranda to complete this wall, and at the same time cut around the garden that's growing up toward the house here. The shadow on the main house starts with some dappled shade from a tree or bush, and then the overhanging veranda causes it to slant across toward the window. As you bring the shadow across and down, make sure you cut around the posts, lacework, and when you get to her, the lady at the gate. It's important here to get that angle right as it disappears behind this post and reappears on the other side of it. I've jumped ahead and you can see that I've painted right over the windows and doors in shade. And here, to create some reflected light, I've dropped in some water in the lower areas and I'm bringing it up to meet the darker paint. Now, I think I'd like to emphasize the deep shade under this cool veranda. So I'm dropping in a much darker mix, but bear in mind this must be done while the washes are still wet and still alive. That's why it's important to keep all your washes under this veranda at a particular wetness at all times. It gives you a lot of scope then to develop it. Couple of last little touches. I'm going back to the church door to emphasize the reveal, and I'm starting at the darker top, and I'll be bringing water up to meet the paint to make the lower half a little lighter. Once again, this is to indicate some reflected light from what would be, if we could see it, a sunny pathway in front of the church. I'm also going to put a little bit more definition into the hedge now. You can see that I'm putting a bit of a dotty, leafy edge where the sun sides of the hedge changes to the shaded side. And this wash will help the fence post here stand out a little bit more. And when I've completed this first wash, while it's still wet, I'm going to create some deeper shade within the hedge by dropping in just a few little spots of darker mix of the same colour. And with that, our picture is really starting to come alive now, and I just can't wait to get started on the trees next. I hope you'll join me then.